Please be seated. The Board of Inquiry into the Hazelwood Mine Fire is now session.
Good morning. And now we come to the culmination of the public hearing process. After 3 weeks of evidence, this is the point where counsel assisting and the parties' representatives make submissions to you about what is to be made of all of the evidence that we've heard over the last 3 weeks and what recommendations the board should make for future improvement. Just to outline the procedure over the next 2 days, I wrote to the representatives appearing for the parties in the course of last week, indicating that oral submissions would be today and tomorrow, and that counsel assisting proposed to address the 3 themes that have been addressed in evidence, and under each heading to identify commendations, criticisms and recommendations to be made. And that is the form that counsel assisting submission will take this morning. I also asked the parties to indicate to me whether they wish to make written or oral submissions today and tomorrow, and have indicated to all of the parties that should anything arise in the course of the next 2 days that they feel they have a need to respond to, that they will have an opportunity to do that in writing after the hearings conclude tomorrow. The proposed order of submissions over the next 2 days is Mr Rosen and I will present our submissions to you this morning, and it's our intention to complete that by lunchtime. Then we will hear from Environment Victoria, who were granted leave to appear in relation to the issue of mitigation and prevention only, and they've indicated that they will need about 45 minutes. We will then hear from the United Firefighters Union. Mr Marshall of the union will be attending to make their submissions this afternoon, and again he's indicated that he will need about 45 minutes in relation to the issue of firefighter safety, which is the issue on which they were granted leave to appear. Then GDF Sewers will make its submissions, and Ms Doyle's indicated that she needs about 2 hours to do that, and likewise Dr Wilson for the state has indicated that he will need about 2 hours to present the state's final submissions. It's not proposed that counsel assisting make any reply. The opportunity over the next 2 days is as much for the parties to present the board with their submissions about findings and recommendations that should be made, and for the board to have an opportunity to interact with the parties' representatives and ask questions and have those questions responded to in this public process. There's only one caveat to that proposed outline. It is conceivable that the state may make some submissions that are adverse to GDF Sewers. I don't know if that will occur. If it does, then Ms Doyle has indicated that she may wish to make some oral submissions after the state has made submissions tomorrow, and if time permits, then it would be desirable for that to happen. But in any event, there will be an opportunity to make any written submissions about any adverse comment that's made by the state. So that's the proposal. If we all stick to the time limits that we've indicated, we should finish comfortably by 3 p.m. tomorrow. The structure of counsel assisting submissions, it will be as follows. I will address the origins of and response to the fires, and I will also address issues of health and environment that were explored during the second week of the hearing. Mr Rosen will deal with the discrete topic of firefighter safety that we dealt with in week 1, but which also has a lot of connections with the health issues raised in week 2. And he will then finish by dealing with mitigation and prevention. And under each of those headings, we will put to the board a number of commendations that the board we submit can make based on the evidence it has heard, a number of criticisms or adverse findings that we propose that the board should make in its report, and a number of recommendations that we propose the board should consider making. Before I move into those four areas of discussion, or the two that I'm responsible for this morning, there is one overarching submission that I make at the outset. And that is that in response to evidence from a number of witnesses that the fire was unprecedented, that it was unpredictable, that it could not have been foreseen. The fire was unprecedented in terms of its size and its impact on the community of Morwell and the broader Latrobe Valley. In every other respect, the fire was not unprecedented. It was not the first time that a bushfire, or a rural fire, as Mr Incoll described it, had entered an open-cut coal mine. It was certainly not the first time that fire in the landscape had threatened an open-cut coal mine. All of the fire planning documents that are in evidence identify specifically the risk of an external fire entering an open-cut coal mine and propose various treatments or measures to control that risk. And with respect to those who were surprised by the entry of a rural fire into an open-cut coal mine, it is, in this landscape, a very obvious risk. This is a notoriously bushfire-prone part of Victoria, and coal burns. That's why it is mined. And in our submission, the board should not be deterred from a close examination of risk management practices and response to fire by evidence that suggests that this was somehow a surprising event. It was not. It was an entirely foreseeable event, and it was one that should have been planned for. Moving then to the first theme, the origins of and response to the fires. What I propose to do under this heading is to set out a number of basic factual findings that the evidence permits the board to make about the origins of the fires that took hold in the mine and the response to them. I will do that in a fairly neutral way to begin with, and then I will come in more detail to some commendations that we submit can be made, and then some criticisms that we submit should be made. It was clear by the Friday, the 7th of February, which was the 5th anniversary of Black Saturday in 2009, that the conditions forecast for the weekend, and in particular for Sunday the 9th, were going to be the worst since Black Saturday. That was well known, it was well publicised, and on the strength of an extreme fire weather forecast, the Chief Officer of the CFA declared a total fire ban not only for the Saturday but also for the Sunday. Also on the Friday, the evidence reveals a fire started at Hearns Oak in about mid-afternoon. Now, Hearns Oak, as we now know from our familiarity with local geography, is roughly to the northwest of Morwell, and it was a fire that was responded to quickly by the CFA, was contained, but was never brought under control. Certainly not on that Friday or over the weekend. In relation to the origins of the fire, there is in evidence a report prepared by a CFA investigator that concludes that the fire was caused by inadequate control of a campfire. Notwithstanding that conclusion, the evidence from Victoria Police in the form of Detective Inspector Roberts' affidavit is that Victoria Police regard the fire as suspicious, and it is the subject of an ongoing investigation. What police can definitely tell us and have told us is that they have excluded both lightning strike and power asset failure as a cause of the fire. So that is where we must leave the evidence about the origin of the fire. The precise origin of it is a matter still being investigated by police. The Hearns Oak fire was managed locally on the Friday, but on the Saturday the 8th, it was control of it was transferred to the Traralgon Incident Control Centre, which is a Level 3 Incident Control Centre. And that transfer had the effect that the fire was then regarded as a Level 3 fire. Incident Controller Lawrence Jeremiah gave evidence about his appreciation of the risk posed by that fire and his determination to apply an aggressive strategy to it during the course of the Saturday. By the evening of the 8th of February, the fire was contained but was still burning within its perimeter. The incident management team at Traralgon, and in particular Mr Jeremiah, was acutely aware of the risk that the fire would pose to Morwell and also to the Yallourn and Hazelwood open cut mines should it break its containment lines the following day. Based on that assessment, Mr Jeremiah asked his planning officer, Mr McHugh, to provide the Central Gippsland Essential Industries Group with Phoenix prediction mapping that showed the scenario that might occur if the fire did break containment lines. And that was done by providing at least one prediction map to Mr Demetrios, who's the chair of the Central Gippsland Essential Industries Group. And the board will remember the evidence about the role of the Central Gippsland Industries Group as a conduit for information between essential industries, including the power stations and the open cut mines in the Latrobe Valley, and the emergency services. Mr Demetrios forwarded one Phoenix prediction map to Mr Roach, who is the Security and Emergency Services Manager at Hazelwood, at about 4:30 on the Saturday afternoon. And that map indicated the potential for fire to spread into the northern batters of the mine by shortly before 2 a.m. on the Monday morning. And I will return to the significance of that communication later on. It's a matter of record now that the weather conditions on the 9th of February were almost exactly as forecast. It was hot, it got hotter, it was windy, it got windier, and the relative humidity was extremely low. And critically, from 1 o'clock the wind moved around to the west, and then at approximately 1:40, as nearly as the Bureau of Meteorology can place it, a strong southwesterly wind change reached Morwell. That wind blew all afternoon with very strong gusts and didn't begin to abate until well into the evening. As we've heard, there was another fire that broke out mid-morning on Saturday the 9th, the Jack River fire that broke out near Yarram, and that was a fire that was managed by the Traralgon ICC and absorbed a good deal of its resources and attention. The fire at one stage, before the wind change, was threatening the township of Yarram. Closer to Morwell, at about 1:15 in the afternoon, the Hearns Oak fire did break its containment lines, still under the influence of strong northwesterly wind. It broke its containment lines in the northeastern rather than the southeastern corner of the fire, which was where fighters had been concentrating their efforts. Having done that, it moved very quickly towards Morwell and towards the Hazelwood open cut mine, so quickly that it was not safe for firefighters to attack the fire directly. Not long afterwards, the wind changed, redirecting the flank of the fire towards Morwell, and as we've heard, creating a spot fire on the other side of Morwell that eventually threatened the APM mill at Maryvale. That fire involved at least one timber plantation, and you will recall the photographs that were presented during the Phoenix presentation that showed a large smoke plume that was bent over by the strong winds. To compound the threat posed by the Hearns Oak fire, at about 1:30, another fire, or should I say fires, ignited at Driffield on the Streslecki Highway. In relation to the origin of this fire, which is known as the Driffield fire, police have told us that they believe this fire to be deliberately lit, and it is the subject of an arson investigation. And again, that's not an area into which the board need go further. Police have been able to exclude both lightning strike and power asset failure as a cause of that fire, and it remains under police investigation. That fire started almost at exactly the time that the wind change came through, and under the influence of very strong southwesterly winds, that fire took off in the direction of the open cut Hazelwood mine and the power station. It was responded to very swiftly by both the CFA and the mines firefighting resources, and as things transpired, the fire front did not pass over the Morwell River diversion. It acted as a very effective firebreak, and the fire was pulled up at that point. Fire was first observed inside the mine, and of course it's that fire that the inquiry is most interested in, just before 2 o'clock that afternoon. The first direct evidence of fire that the inquiry has is from James Major, who saw smoke in the southeastern batters, his designation, at about 1:55. Shortly after that, at about 2:30, he saw some smoke on the northern batters. Shortly after 2:15, David Shanahan observed fire on the floor of the mine and also fire on 2, possibly 3 levels of the northern batters. Or at least that had escalated to 2, possibly 3 levels by just before 3 o'clock. So as the day went on, the fires in the southeastern batters grew and extended to the eastern batters, and the fire in the northern batters involved all of the levels. The fire in the southeastern batters and the floor of the mine eventually merged and became one area of fire that was had to be suppressed later on. In relation to the cause of the fires in the mine, our submission is that the inquiry can make the following findings. The fires in the mine started, in our submission, as a result of ember throw from the Hearns Oak fire. It is possible, but much less likely, that the fires were ignited by ember throw from the Driffield fire. Although this suspicion was raised in numerous submissions to the inquiry, there is no evidence before the inquiry that the fires, particularly the fire in the northern batters, started from internal sources. Notably, there is very clear evidence before the inquiry that the fire in the northern batters started about 300 metres to the west of the fire hole that had been clay-capped and has been referred to in evidence as Old Faithful. And you'll recall a very clear photograph that was taken by Mr Shanahan that shows the relative positions of Old Faithful and the beginnings of the fire in the northern batters. That submission is based on the direct evidence of witnesses, in particular Mr Major and Mr Shanahan, but is confirmed by the Phoenix simulation that was presented to the board on the second day of the hearing, that indicates that the most likely source of ignition was ember throw from the Hearns Oak fire. Importantly, there is no clear evidence before the board that fire established in the west field of the mine on the 9th of February. There was a small fire during the morning that was reported to WorkSafe, and so we have some quite specific details about that fire that was caused by a mechanical fault on an idler. But that fire was rapidly extinguished in the morning and didn't form part of the matrix of events that afternoon. There is a second-hand report in Mr Shanahan's statement of fire in the west field, but no direct observation, and it is not possible to be certain that there was any outbreak of fire in the west field during the course of the afternoon. What we do know is that by the time the CFA took over and developed its incident action plan from the next morning, there was no fire in the Westfield to contend with. Anything that did start was clearly put out quickly. With fire in several areas, worked out areas of the mine, at shortly before 3 o'clock, Mr Harkins declared a full-blown emergency and asked Mr Prezioso to assume the role of emergency commander, which he did at about 3:20, formally activating the emergency control centre at the mine. In terms of the mine's firefighting resources and their response to the fire, they were understandably initially focused on the western perimeter of the mine, dealing with the very direct threat of the Driffield fire advancing towards the operational area of the mine. Mine personnel were able to reach both the fire in the southeastern batters and the fire in the northern batters at a very early stage, but as described particularly in Mr Major's statement, they were unable to extinguish either of those fires. Mr Prezioso, once he took control as emergency commander, maintained the focus on the western perimeter of the mine and also brought in a crane monitor in the southeastern batters to prevent, or in an attempt to prevent, that fire from spreading to the west towards important infrastructure essential to the mine and to the power station's operations. Shortly after that, Mr Shanahan turned on sprays on the northern batters that created a very effective water barrier and again contained the fire from spreading towards the operational face of the mine and the western end of the northern batters. Although it's not entirely clear how they found out about it, by 2:30, the Traralgon ICC was working on the basis that there was fire in the mine. Mr Roach's evidence was that he spoke with Mr McHugh at the ICC at about 2:45 and told him that there was fire spotting inside the open cut, in addition to talking about the situation with the Driffield fire. By that time, the resources available to the Traralgon ICC were heavily committed to the Jack River fire and also the Hearns Oak fire that was threatening lives and properties in the west of Morwell and later was creating difficulty on the other side of Morwell near the APM mill at Maryvale, and also, of course, the Driffield fire. The evidence indicates that the only fire service resources that were deployed at the mine during the afternoon of the 9th of February was an aeroplane and a helicopter that dropped some loads of water and retardant on the fire in the northern batters. At some stage in the evening, probably between 6 and 7, the fire ran out of the eastern batters onto the grassed area at the top of the mine and threatened energy bricks. and also damaged the conveyor that supplies energy bricks. There was, at that point, CFA assistance deployed to initially to energy bricks, but then to the mine. And as best we can pinpoint, those resources arrived at the gate, and Mr. Lawler was among that strike team at about 6:45. There had been another strike team that attended earlier in the afternoon, but as soon as they reported, they were called away to deal with the Driffield fire. At about the same time, again, we don't know the exact time, but it was between about 5 and about 7 in the evening, the mine lost power. The reason for that was that the fire had burned poles for 2 separate SP AusNet lines that run down the northern batters. And they supply the mine's power, including the power for the dredger and the conveyor belts from mains power external to the mine. Without power, the pumps that pressurised the fire services pipe network couldn't operate, and water supply was reduced at best to a trickle. And of course, as dark fell, the emergency command centre was unable to see what was going on. By that stage, there was not much that could be done to suppress the fires in the batters, and efforts focused on asset protection around the perimeter of the mine, particularly on the northern batters and the eastern batters near energy bricks. The CFA arrived with more resources in the course of the evening and formally took control of the fire at about 10 o'clock that night. Mr. Lockwood of the CFA became the division commander. The Incident Control Centre was still at that stage based in Traralgon. And the board will recall the handwritten incident action plan that is a very clear summary of how things stood at daybreak on the 10th of February. There was a separate incident management structure fairly rapidly set up to deal with what was clearly going to be a long-term fire, and that was in place from the 11th of February. The incident controllers at various stages for the fire are identified in paragraph 24, and we've heard evidence or received evidence from a number of them. The initial suppression strategy that was adopted focused very much on containment and preventing the fire from spreading and affecting any critical infrastructure. It's fair to say that little, if any, progress was made in the first week actually putting out the fire. There was a shift in gears, if you like, on the 13th of February when the State Controller, Mr. Lapsley, declared that in addition to being a fire, it was a hazmat incident, and that was due largely to the carbon monoxide that was being emitted, threatening both firefighters and broader community. Over the next week, a much more sophisticated suppression strategy was developed and applied steadily over the next month. And your board members will recall the evidence of Mr. Barry, who described the processes like eating an elephant and described the 6 stages that he went through, or that the incident management team went through with each 100 metre section of the elephant. During that long attempt to bring the fire under control and eventually extinguish it altogether, the weather continued to be, on occasions, hot and dry, and there were a number of forecast spike days, as the incident controllers referred to them. And so in addition to suppressing the fire, it was also necessary to plan on those days to prevent the fire from spreading. And Mr. Barry gave evidence about the lengths that were taken, particularly on the 25th of February, to prevent fire from spreading out of the out of the worked out areas of the mine towards infrastructure, and on the 25th of February towards the power station and the coal bunker. And that planning was effective and enabled the fire to be suppressed, or the spread fire to be suppressed almost immediately. There was a very effective working relationship established between the fire services and the mine personnel as the firefight went on, and Mr Dugan described this in some detail in his evidence. The efforts of the mine personnel in large part were taken up with laying additional pipes to supplement the existing fire services network. And Mr Dugan described the liaison arrangements and the regular meetings that took place between him and those responsible for the firefight at the mine and at the Incident Control Centre. What was notable from that evidence, however, is that the mine and the fire services maintained parallel incident management teams throughout that period, although there was very close liaison between them. Two significant dates, of course, are the 10th of March and the 25th of March. On the 10th of March, the fire was declared controlled, in that it was no longer spreading and sufficient resources were on hand to prevent it spreading. And then on the 25th of March, it was declared safe. Mr Lapsley explained that that means that the fire is out and it won't create smoke, although it being a brown coal mine, there may remain hotspots or areas of heat that may flare up from time to time. Moving now to the commendations that arise out of that basic factual history, and of course there's a great deal more detail in the evidence that the board may include in its report. We come to the commendations. And I just note at this stage that natural justice or fairness requires that parties be given notice of potential adverse findings that may be made against them. And that has the sometimes undesirable effect of requiring us to focus on the negative. But there is much that can be said that is positive about both the preparation for the 9th of February and the response to the fires around and in the mine. The first thing that can be said is that fire service were generally very well prepared for the extreme fire weather conditions on the 9th of February. And in particular, the Traralgon ICC was established with an experienced Level 3 incident controller in place and almost a full complement of personnel. It was already managing a fire in the Hearns Oak fire, but the state of readiness contrasts very favourably with the state of unreadiness that the Bushfires Royal Commission commented on in some instances on Black Saturday. The CFA and the mine personnel responded very rapidly to the Driffield fire, and between them, on either side of the Morwell River diversion, they were able to prevent the fire from crossing the Morwell River diversion and entering the operating area of the mine. It could indeed have been a great deal worse had that fire not been pulled up when and where it was. While fire did take hold in the worked out batters, there were effective steps taken by mine personnel to prevent the fire from spreading westwards towards the operating face of the mine and critical mine infrastructure. Again, it could have been a lot worse than it was had those steps not been taken. Once the Hearns Oak fire escaped its containment lines, the CFA's response was rapid and effective, and there were, critically, no lives lost in the west of Morwell when the potential for loss of life was clearly there. The board can find in our submission that the allocation of resources in the Latrobe Valley by the Traralgon ICC was consistent with the State Controller's intent or the strategic priorities that were set by Mr Lapsley and explained in his evidence that prioritises the protection and preservation of life over the protection of critical infrastructure and community assets. Mine personnel worked hard and in extraordinarily difficult conditions on the evening of the 9th of February to restore power, which was not only important to enable the firefight to continue, but was important to enable the mining of coal and the production of electricity to continue. The achievement of doing that in the conditions that they faced is not to be underestimated. Also not to be underestimated is the fact that GDF Sewers was able to maintain power production at its power station throughout the entire incident. The fire, however, was vast and very difficult to extinguish, having as it did an almost inexhaustible supply of fuel, and the suppression strategy that was developed and implemented is also to be commended. The fire had the potential to burn for a great deal longer than 6 weeks, and it is to the credit of all of those involved that it was controlled as soon as it was. The other aspect of the firefight that deserves special mention is the very careful planning and placing of resources for the forecast spike days. That prevented fire spreading further on those days, and in particular on the 25th of February, prevented fire from entering the coal bunker and threatening the power station. So there is much that can be commended in the preparation and response for the fires on the 9th of February, but there are also a number of things that could have been done better. The first of the criticisms identified by Council Assisting relates to the fire services preparation. Mr Jeremiah was acutely aware of the risk posed by the Hearns Oak fire on the 8th of February, and in anticipation of the weather conditions forecast for the following day, he requested some additional resources, 3 strike teams and also a number of aircraft. Rather than 3 strike teams, 2 were made available, but more importantly, the additional aircraft that he requested on the afternoon of the 8th of February didn't arrive in the Latrobe Valley until about noon the following day. That meant, in effect, that he was not able to use those resources to attack the Hearns Oak fire, and we will never know whether those resources may have assisted in containing that fire. But it is regrettable that, having identified the need for those resources, acutely aware of the risk that the fire posed to both Morwell and critical infrastructure, that those resources were not in place and able to be used even on the evening of the 8th of February. The other criticism that needs to be made of the fire services preparedness is that, contrary to Joint Standard Operating Procedure 2.03, which deals with readiness arrangements for incident management teams, there was no base incident management team in place at the Yarram Incident Control Centre. As events transpired, there was a fire that would have been managed from Yarram had there been an IMT in place there, the Jack River fire. That fire was managed from the Traralgon ICC and necessarily diverted a good deal of its attention that was required to deal with the developing situation around Morwell. Had there been a base IMT in place at Yarram, it wouldn't have created additional resources to respond to the fires in and around the Latrobe Valley. There would still have been that constraint on the response, but it would certainly have enabled Mr Jeremiah and his team to focus on the very complex situation that was developing around Morwell in the course of that afternoon, more than they were able to do. The next series of criticisms is directed at the mine and those who are responsible for its management. In our submission, personnel at the mine did not sufficiently appreciate the very grave risk that was posed to the mine by the Hearns Oak fire burning to its northwest and the extreme fire weather predictions that were forecast for the Sunday. Instead of planning for the worst, they hoped for the best. There is repeated in the evidence of GDF witnesses an air of injured surprise that this should have happened because it had never happened in their experience. As I submitted at the outset, it was a risk that was entirely foreseeable in a general sense, and in the conditions that prevailed on the Saturday evening, it was a very real risk indeed. The mine fire preparedness and mitigation plans, which are supposed to be put in place for days of high fire danger, had been prepared on the Friday morning and had not been updated to include the rather critical fact that there was a fire then burning to the northwest of the mine. Despite having been provided with a Phoenix prediction map on the Saturday afternoon that indicated the potential for fire to reach the northern batters of the mine by 2 a.m. on the Monday, Mr Roach, the nominated Emergency Services Liaison Officer, didn't pass that information on to anyone at the mine who was responsible for fire preparation or response. He didn't pass it on to Mr Shanahan or to Mr Faithful, saying that he preferred to see what would eventuate the following day. He didn't obtain updated information either from the Central Gippsland Essential Industries Group, although he did have a discussion with Mr Demetrios the following morning, or directly from the Traralgon ICC. He had no direct contact with the Traralgon ICC until after the fires were well alight. So while being critical of GDF Sewers for not appreciating the significance of that Phoenix prediction map, it needs also to be said that that information could have been provided to it in a more helpful way. The map that was actually provided to Mr Roach appears to have been the least helpful of the three that were available to the Traralgon ICC, and it would clearly have been useful for Mr Roach and for anyone else looking at that information to have had some explanation of its significance. For example, that it was a scenario, the events that the scenario was based on, the fact that the scenario might be different in the event of different weather conditions or in the event of a different breakout of the Hearns Oak fire. That also highlights the dangers of relying on indirect means of communication at times where there is a very real threat looming, because of course passing the information through a third party does create the risk that a message will not be clearly understood. And of course the board's not heard evidence from either Mr McHugh or from Mr Demetrios, although Mr Demetrios was put on notice by us of the mentions of him in the evidence, and we've not heard further from him. So the board's unable to make detailed findings about which individuals bear responsibility for what appears to have been suboptimal communication of risk. But our submission remains that the mine, having been given this piece of information, this prediction map, should have appreciated the grave risk that it faced and should certainly have been more proactive about finding out what the prediction map signified. The next criticism to be made of the mine's preparedness is that it did not pre-populate its emergency command structure in anticipation of a fire. The board will recall that the mine's emergency response plan nominates a number of emergency commanders, ranging from the mine director to the shift supervisor for the 2x12 shift, which is essentially the supervisor of the people who are mining the coal. None of the senior mine personnel who were designated as emergency commander were on site when fire broke out. All of them were away from Morwell. Mr Wilkinson was in Queensland. The acting mine director, Mr Faithful, was in Inverloch. Mr Dugan had gone to Malakuta, and Mr Kemsley, the technical compliance manager, was not on site either. That left the most junior in the mine's management hierarchy, Ian Wilkinson, the shift supervisor, as the only nominated emergency commander on site. Now, he obviously had operational responsibilities on that day, and there's no evidence to suggest that he actually assumed the role of emergency commander at any time on the afternoon of the 9th of February. That state of readiness is to be prepared with the Traralgon ICC, which was in place with almost a full complement of people in all of the IMT roles, with an experienced incident controller leading that team. And it's also to be contrasted with the mine state of readiness on an earlier occasion when Mr Prezioso was an emergency commander, an occasion of protest outside the front gates of the Hazelwood power station, which was an incident that in our submission posed a much less grave threat to the operations of the mine and the power station, and yet there was Mr Prezioso already in place in anticipation of things not turning out well. That lack of preparedness meant that when fire did break out in the mine on the afternoon of the Sunday, mine personnel were essentially caught flat-footed. And that explains why in our submission the implementation of the emergency response plan was so slow. Fire had been burning in the mine since just before 2 o'clock on the earliest witness's account, but the emergency response plan was not implemented until 20 past 3, and only then, after somebody who really sits outside the emergency command structure, Mr Harkins, had taken control and declared a full-blown emergency. And even then, after the emergency response plan had been activated and the emergency command structure was in place, no one thought to take the basic step of checking whether the CFA had been notified by calling 000. It is absolutely plain in both the mine fire instructions and the emergency response plan that that is the first step to take, and it was not taken. The next two criticisms both relate to infrastructure at the mine that was critical to the fire suppression effort. There was no backup power supply at the mine when power was lost. Without power, the fire services water system was reduced to a trickle and was essentially ineffective until power was restored, and the emergency command centre was in darkness, had no access to working computers or to printers. There is a certain irony in a power generator being without power during a critical incident, and it is something that is addressed in the recommendations that I will come to shortly. The other criticism is that the efforts to suppress the fires, both early on and as the fire continued, were hampered by limited reticulated water in the worked out batters of the mine. As Mr Polmere explained to the board last week, pipes were removed between the mid-1990s and 2007 and were not replaced. And there is a very close correlation between the pipes that were removed during that period and the new pipes that were laid during the firefight. Moving to the recommendations that we submit should be made in response to those criticisms, or indeed observations. The first of those is that for future incidents, the mine and the fire services should operate integrated incident management teams, which incorporate both the emergency services personnel and the Hazelwood personnel in one incident management team responding to an incident. And there are two things that we submit should happen to bring that about. The first is that the Emergency Management Commissioner and the CFA should work with GDF Sewers and also other essential industry participants. This could well have happened in another open cut mine or in another essential industry run by another private operator, to implement the Australasian Inter-Service Incident Management System, or AIMS, which is in use by fire services here in Victoria and across Australia, and has proved to be a very useful incident management system, allowing interchangeability of personnel from a whole range of different settings in one integrated incident management team. And then to enable that to happen, GDF Sewers should ensure that those people who are nominated in its emergency response plan as emergency commanders should undergo incident management training to achieve incident controller accreditation. Not necessarily to level 3, but at least a basic level of incident controller accreditation, so that they achieve proficiency in AIMS and can manage an incident team in response to an incident at the mine or at the power station. The board will appreciate, from having seen the evidence of Mr Jeremiah, Mr Barry and Mr Haynes, that incident management is a skill. It is not just something that can be done applying common sense and management experience, and it is a skill that no doubt can partly be learned by experience, but also benefits from some formal instruction. And in our submission, this is an investment that GDF Sewers and indeed any operator of essential industry should make in its staff.
You haven't gone the further step of saying that the system should provide for the personnel of GDF Sewers to be integrated so that when the fire agencies take over, the personnel are treated as part of that team rather than two teams working together.
Well, that is the intent of the proposed recommendation.
But what you've not specifically said. You think as part of the review, talking together, that should be one of the things that they should address?
There's no review proposed. It's a straight recommendation that's proposed, and the starting point is that there should in future be integrated incident management teams that incorporate...
And that's just, you'd say, a necessary incident of that process?
Yes. So initially what one would envisage is that there would be a GDF Sewers person managing the incident, and if the incident can be dealt with without involving external agencies, then well and good. But incident manager or incident controller accreditation will undoubtedly be of use in managing even small incidents. If the incident is taken over by an external agency, in this case the fire services, what we submit should be recommended is that that person manage an integrated incident management team in which mine personnel participate, rather than the two parallel teams that were in operation during this mine fire. So that's the first of the recommendations arising out of the response to the fires. The second is that GDF Sewers in our submission should revise its emergency response plan to increase its state of readiness on days of total fire ban. And that should include requiring pre-positioning of an accredited incident controller as an emergency commander and pre-establishment of an emergency command centre. If a fire is burning anywhere in the mine, it's not a good time to be opening rooms and making sure the chairs are there and the computers are turned on, that should already been done, so that a person who is already there and has the training and the skills to take command of a complex situation can immediately swing into action. The third of the recommendations arising from this part of the evidence is that GDF Sewers should review its power supply arrangements in light of its experience this year, and should put in place backup power supply arrangements that do not depend wholly on mains power. These backup power supply arrangements should, at a minimum, ensure that the Emergency Command Centre can continue to operate if mains power is lost, and that there is some remaining capacity in the fire services water system. This is as simple as installing a generator to power the Emergency Command Centre. It is less simple in relation to the fire water system because it is so vast, but in our submission, the feasibility of having some internal generation capacity should be explored, and we note that in installing the pipes during the recent fire, there was for the first time some internal generating capacity included. Mr Graham gave evidence on Friday about a number of proposals to create redundancy, to change the switching arrangements, and I don't pretend to have followed that evidence. It's clear that there's a great deal of thought and expertise from electrical engineers that's gone into it. The fault, it seems to me, with the proposal is that it still relies entirely on mains power entering the mine. And it is very common experience during a fire for mains power to be lost, not necessarily because of conditions on your property, but because of conditions at some distance. And in our submission, it's appropriate for the mine operator to examine its backup power supply arrangements.
Could I just raise one potential criticism that you have not addressed, and that is that in relation to the power situation, there might have been a reassessment of appropriate priorities so that whilst it was clear that attending to the fire or minimising the risk of fire in the operating section, priority should have been given to the potential impact of the fire on the northern area where the power lines were, because it might have reasonably be anticipated that what did happen might happen, and so the priority should have accorded greater priority than was given to the possibility of the poles being set on fire and therefore compromising the power.
Yeah, so there's no indication, and really the first person who gave evidence of being in a position of command of the incident and assessing where resources ought to be placed was Mr Prezioso, who didn't step into that role until after 3 o'clock.
So in effect, you're saying that might be seen as an incident of the lack of preparation?
In my submission, it could be found that those responsible for responding to the fire at the mine didn't appreciate the significance of the power lines that enter the mine. And although they are duplicated, they do actually run through the Northern Batters side by side, so a fire in the Northern Batters always had the potential to affect both of them.
Could I just ask a couple of questions? Do you have a view about timelines for these recommendations? Is there a sense of urgency, bearing in mind the fire season is going to be on us within a few months?
In relation to the first two proposed recommendations, in our submission there's no reason why those things could not be in place by the next fire season. In relation to the third of the proposed recommendations concerning the power supply, that the implementation of that will rely on technical matters that are very much outside our expertise, and there's no real evidence before the board that could could assist it in determining what a reasonable timeline is. Certainly the generator for the Emergency Command Centre ought not to be a complex matter, but internal power or internal generation capacity to pressurise the fire services pipe network in my submission is not something that could have a definite timeline put on it.
And Ms Richards, thank you. It was very clearly put out. The recommendations, would they be in addition to those recommendations that GDF proposed on Friday through Mr Graham's evidence? And some of those were around training in the Phoenix modelling, training in firefighting and equipment, fire training specific to Hazelwood.
As I understood Mr Graham's evidence, those were things that GDF is planning to do in any event.
Okay.
Our proposed recommendations picked up matters that we didn't apprehend that they were planning to do in any event, and perhaps refined or put a different cast on the proposal that there be further training in firefighting. In our submission, there's a particular need for incident management training, so that there can be an effective coordinated response. Given that the evidence is all one way, that the best way of dealing with fire in the mine is to put it out as quickly as possible. So that for an effective response, GDF sewers is going to have to be self-sufficient in most instances. If it's necessary to call the CFA or for the CFA to take control of an incident, then the fire has already spread out of control.
Well, I think that's cleared that up, that the recommendations will be in addition, as you say, to those that GDF have committed to. So.
Yes, well, I'm sure that I'll be corrected if I've misunderstood that, but I did understand Mr Graham's evidence to be that these were things that GDF was proposing to do in any event, having had the experience that it had in February and March and having listened to and reflected to the evidence that's been presented in the course of the public hearings.
Thank you.
Now, moving to the second area of submissions, in the second week of the public hearings, we covered a very large stretch of activity ranging from air quality monitoring to public health to relief and recovery, decisions made in relation to schools and communications. Time has not permitted an outline of basic factual findings that we propose be made in relation to that week's evidence. So I'll move straight into the commendations, the criticisms and the recommendations that arise. Firstly, the commendations, and the first two of these relate to the Environment Protection Authority's activities during the fire. The EPA was able to deploy an impressively qualified group of air quality scientists to undertake monitoring in the Latrobe Valley after it was requested to do so on the 11th of February. And it was able to provide indicative air quality data from around the 13th of February. And then with quite impressive rapidity, it was providing validated air quality data from the 19th of February from South Morwell, and earlier than that at the Hourigan Road site in East Morwell. Although it didn't have suitable air monitoring equipment for rapid deployment in an emergency, and that's an area that I'll return to, that was quickly sourced from interstate. So although some criticism is made later of the EPA in relation to its starting position in an emergency, given its starting position, it responded very quickly and effectively and with, as I say, impressive expertise. The other area for commendation in our submission is the EPA's preparedness to seek peer reviews of the carbon monoxide protocol that was developed together with the Department of Health during the fire, and also the programs that it had undertaken for monitoring and assessment of air quality, soil and ash and water. On each of those three areas, the EPA went to external experts and said, are we doing the right thing? Are we monitoring the right things? Is there more that we should be doing? Should we be placing the monitors in other places? While that was commendable, the benefits of the activity would have been greater had the fact that this external validation had been sought been shared with the public. So the public would have had that assurance of other experts having reviewed what the EPA was doing and having given it their approval. Although, as I will return to, the peer review that the EPA obtained of the carbon monoxide protocol was not an affirmation of that protocol. Moving next to the Department of Health, which includes the Chief Health Officer, a matter of very strong commendation should be, in our submission, the establishment and operation of the Community Health Assessment Centre in Morwell from the 21st of February right through to the end of March. That centre was, as is evident from the evidence of a number of community witnesses, a welcome source of information and reassurance during the uncertain weeks of the smoke from the mine fire. Professor Brooks' evidence was that there were over 2,000 people had attended it during the fire, and it was clearly a very welcome measure and well used by the community. That said, its benefits again would have been enhanced had there been greater involvement of local health services providers and in particular general practitioners in the establishment and operation of the centre, not necessarily as clinicians but as another means of informing the community and reassuring the community to the extent that it was possible to do so. Also commendable was the action taken by the Department of Health to seek peer reviews of both its carbon monoxide protocol and the PM 2.5 protocol that was developed during the fire. It also obtained a rapid health risk assessment from the Monash University School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine, which is a very thorough and impressive document. Once again, there is a caveat, however, that the benefits of this external expertise would have been enhanced if the fact that they were being sought had been shared with the public, and in relation to the rapid health risk assessment, if it had been obtained at an earlier date. The third area of commendation in our submission is the long-term health study that the Department of Health has also has embarked on subsequent to the fire. This is a study that will benefit both the local community who were exposed to the smoke by providing monitoring of any long-term adverse health effects, and it will also, in addition to having very real health benefits for those people who were here breathing in the smoke, it will also address an existing gap that became clear during the course of the fire in medical understanding of the long-term health effects of exposures such as were experienced this year, and will assist health authorities and others in their future policy development and their responses to similar incidents in future. There are some areas for improvement in the proposed long-term health study, and these are addressed in a recommendation that I'll come to in a while. Under the heading of communications, there should in our submission be recognition of the clear communications during the acute phase of the fire on the 9th of February, before it became established as a mine fire and it was simply a bushfire situation. ABC local radio and local commercial radio provided timely and responsive information, and the CFA provided, again, timely and helpful community information and warnings through a range of different platforms, including its Fire Ready app, its website and text messages that a number of community witnesses have confirmed that they received on the 9th of February. The fire services, and in particular the CFA, should also be commended for their sustained efforts to provide the community with information during the course of the fire, right through February and into March. Fire Services Commissioner Lapsley was widely appreciated in the community for the forthright and honest way that he presented information to the public. Community witnesses also commented favourably on the frankness of incident controllers at community meetings. It was more welcome to hear that while fire services didn't know how long the fire would take to put out, they were doing all they could to bring it under control. As the firefight went on, the CFA was highly visible in the community and engaged in communication with the community through a range of quite innovative face-to-face means. The community information bus was a successful measure. Community meetings were, with one exception that I'll come to, and the engagement of the Morwell Neighbourhood House was a successful means of reaching the community. Mention should also be made of a range of community leaders and networks. For example, Morwell Neighbourhood House and Voices of the Valley, who I identify because we've heard specifically from people involved in those organisations, who utilised social media and arranged community meetings and filled what was perceived by many in the community to be an information gap. Moving next to the area of schools and children's services, first commendation goes to the Latrobe City Council and its decisive action in closing the Maryvale Crescent Early Learning Centre from the 10th of February. As we've heard from a number of witnesses, that early learning centre is extraordinarily close to the mine. And it wasn't necessary for anyone to wait for air quality data or decision-making protocols to make a judgment that it was untenable for children to be there. The Department of Education and Early Childhood Development also acted relatively quickly, although not as quickly, to relocate children from Commercial Road Primary School in Morwell to other primary schools in Moe and Newborough, and it did that from the 20th of February. And although we've not heard evidence specifically from the Catholic Education Office, it's apparent from Mr Jackman's evidence to the board last week that the Catholic Education Office relocated Sacred Heart Primary School, which is just near Commercial Road Primary School, on the same day. A range of other schools and children's services in Morwell were closed or relocated at various stages during the fire, but it would appear that all of them had either closed or relocated by the 20th of February. These are schools that were on the southern side of Commercial Road. Another commendation is both to the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development and the Catholic Education Office for arranging comprehensive cleaning of both of the primary schools in Commercial Road, the Sacred Heart Primary School and the Commercial Road Primary School, before children returned to the school at the beginning of Term 2. Moving to the areas of relief and recovery, there's been a good deal of community criticism about aspects of the relief and recovery effort, and in particular in relation to the respite and relocation payments that were administered by the Department of Human Services. But in our submission, it should be acknowledged that these were payments that did not have to be made, and that they were made relatively quickly, displaying fairly flexible application of a pre-existing program, in particular the Personal Hardship Assistance Program. The benefits of these payment schemes were diminished, and I'll come to this in a little while, by poorly explained eligibility criteria, but that should not detract too much from the fact that they were made available in the first place. Clearly there were a lot of people who had access to assistance that need not necessarily have been provided at all. There were a range of other respite initiatives that were made available through the leadership of DHS, and all of these helped in varied ways to alleviate the effects of the smoke during the mine fire. Some of these were quite innovative, and one of the most appreciated appears to have been the free V-line travel that just allowed people to leave Morwell, either to go to a neighbouring town or to travel into Melbourne to take advantage of other respite measures that were available, such as free visits to the zoo. We've had a little evidence about this from Mr Hall of DHS and Mr Mitchell of the Council, and also from Ms Brooke Burke, who runs a small business of her own, about support and assistance that was made available for small businesses in Morwell. And again, that was a reasonably significant amount of money that was made, and clearly, in Ms Burke's case at least, it has assisted to defray some of the costs that were incurred by her business due to the smoke from the fire. GDF Sewers has provided additional stimulus to the Morwell business community, particularly the retail sector, through its Revive Morwell initiative, and it is also looking to inject $500,000 into the Morwell community through its Community Social Capital Committee, which is working with a range of community organisations to identify projects that will build community social capital in Morwell. And another measure that we shouldn't overlook, because we've all been passing by it every day during these hearings, is the Community Information and Recovery Centre that was established in this building at the end of February. It has operated to provide a whole range, a central location for a whole range of assistance to affected members of the community, ranging from the loan of vacuum cleaners through to the availability of insurance brokers to provide advice to people about their insurance claims, and indeed to assist them with their claims. And Mr Mitchell gave evidence of a quite successful initiative that has come from those insurance brokers' work. Moving from the positives to the things that could have been done better, the first criticism relates to the EPA's state of readiness to respond as a support agency during an emergency. The EPA is designated in the Emergency Management Manual as a support agency for emergencies, and of course it has one emergency for which it is the control agency, pollution of inland waterways. Notwithstanding that, its role in emergency management, it just was not well equipped to measure air emissions from an emergency within a short time of that emergency commencing. Although it sourced and deployed the required equipment fairly quickly, there was still an unsatisfactory delay in providing air quality data for decision makers, including the incident controller and the Chief Health Officer. And that delay between the request to the EPA to start providing air quality data and when it began providing high quality validated data from the mobile laboratory at the bowling club encompassed that weekend of the 15th and 16th of February when conditions were acutely bad. During that weekend, only indicative data was available, and as we shall see, that was not that indicative data was not acted on by the Department of Health over that weekend. There are a number of areas of criticism in our submission of the Department of Health and the Chief Health Officer. The first of those relates to the carbon monoxide protocol that was developed by the Department of Health on the 16th of February. And the board will recall the series of events over that weekend. These are outlined probably most helpfully in Commander Katsikas's witness statement. There were readings of carbon monoxide in the community on the Saturday the 15th of February that exceeded those levels identified as acceptable for the community in the health management and decontamination plan that was being applied by fire services to their firefighters. On that basis, the incident controller issued a watch and act message that several witnesses have attested to receiving on their mobile phones. On the 16th of February, there was a change implemented to the way in which this information would be assessed and advice given about whether a warning was necessary. And integral to that was the development of the carbon monoxide protocol on the 16th of February by officers of the Department of Health. Now, again, we've not had detailed evidence from the people who are involved in developing that protocol on the day and the influences on them. But what is apparent from the face of the two documents, the carbon monoxide protocol and the health and decontamination plan, is that they apply very different exposure levels. And perplexingly, we see that levels which are not considered safe for firefighters who are fit adults who have already undergone screening before they're permitted onto the fireground are greatly exceeded in the carbon monoxide protocol that was developed by the Department of Health in mid-February. The reasons for the differences between these two sets of exposure levels has not been satisfactorily explained to the inquiry in my submission. And Mr. Lapsley certainly was not able to do so on Friday, and there was really no effort to explain the reasons for the discrepancy, accepting that one adopts an acute exposure standard developed in the United States and the other applies the Safe Work Australia standard here in Australia. It remains completely unclear why the community should tolerate exposure standards that would not be expected of firefighters. This confusion on our part is confirmed by the peer reviews that were obtained of the carbon monoxide protocol by the EPA. It went to two respected epidemiologists and sought their opinion, and at the risk of oversimplifying what those peer reviews say, and these are attached to Mr. Merritt's statement, both of them said that in a prolonged event, the levels that were applied in the carbon monoxide protocol were too high and should be reduced. Mr. Merritt's evidence was that he expected that those peer reviews would have been provided to Dr. Lester. Dr. Lester's evidence was that she was not aware of them. In any event, we are all aware of them now, and it is clear that those two protocols for carbon monoxide exposure, one for firefighters and one for the community at large, need to be reviewed and need to be made consistent one with the other. And the advice of the epidemiologists who undertook those peer reviews of the carbon monoxide protocol should be heeded. That's something that I'll return to when I come to the recommendations. That criticism about the carbon monoxide protocol and the levels that were adopted in it is connected with the next area of criticism, which relates specifically to the response to reports of high carbon monoxide levels in southern Morwell on the 16th of February. On the evening of the 16th of February, the EPA reported very high levels of PM2.5 and dangerously high levels of carbon monoxide to the Department of Health. And that report was in an email from Dr. Torre of the EPA to Vicky Lynch of the Department of Health. What the email showed were a number of, and at this stage it was only indicative data, there was not the high quality data that began to be produced from the Bowling Club mobile laboratory later on in that week, but it indicated a number of things. The first was that during the morning, from midnight to 8:30, there had been an 8-hour average level recorded between 25 and 45 parts per million. The second thing that it showed was that during a 5-hour period that afternoon, between 1:30 and 6:30, there were a series of 5-minute readings that were at alarmingly high levels. At the Morwell Bowling Club, levels were recorded over that period between 25 and 57 parts per million, and at the Maryvale Kindergarten they were recorded between 20 and 44 parts per million. Now, these were 5-minute readings, but they were taken using the same kind of monitors that firefighters use on the fireground. If the readings were taken at intervals over a 4-hour period, it was, of course, possible to arrive at an indicative conclusion about what the average readings would have been. And if those readings did represent average carbon monoxide levels in those areas, they were high enough to warrant at least a watch and act message to shelter in place, even under the high levels that were adopted in the carbon monoxide protocol developed by the Department of Health that day. Notwithstanding that indicative data, the Department of Health determined to take no action other than issuing a routine bushfire smoke protocol, bushfire smoke advisory for the following day. There was no action taken that evening when carbon monoxide levels were known to be high and in excess of the high standards that the Department of Health had identified. Professor Campbell, in his evidence, said that sometimes to make no decision is to make a decision, and this was one of those occasions. In our submission, the inaction on that evening was dangerous, and it is fortunate that, as far as we know, no harm resulted. A further area of criticism relates to the Chief Health Officer's advice on the 28th of February that those vulnerable groups living south of Commercial Road should consider temporary relocation. The criticism doesn't relate to that advice as it stood. The criticism relates to the timing of that advice. In our submission, it was provided too late. The State Emergency Management Team had been advised from the 12th of February that the fire was likely to burn for up to a month and would have significant long-term implications for the community. In light of that advice, in our submission, it was not appropriate for health authorities to operate on a day-by-day basis in the advice they were giving to the community. There was sufficient indicative air quality data available from the EPA by at least the 16th of February, based on Dr. Torre's rough calculation that the levels in the south of Morwell were 2 to 3 times the levels that were being recorded at Hourigan Road. For the Chief Health Officer to be satisfied that the levels of PM10 and PM2.5 vastly exceeded ambient air quality standards and were likely to do so from time to time for a number of weeks. Providing advice to consider temporarily relocating if you are in a vulnerable group in an area heavily affected by smoke is a very gentle measure to suggest. It's not an evacuation, and there was certainly nothing compulsory about the advice that was proffered. But as we have seen from evidence, a number of people were waiting for that advice, almost that permission to leave. It should have come earlier. It would have been from at least the 16th of February, consistent with the precautionary principle that appears in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, to proffer that advice to the community, and it would not have been disproportionate to the risk faced. Another area of criticism of the temporary relocation advice is the basis on which the advice was limited to those living south of Commercial Road. Dr. Lester, in her evidence, was quite definite that the basis for choosing Commercial Road as the dividing line was based on different readings from the Morwell Bowling Club and the Hourigan Road Air Monitoring Station. She did not refer to her, in her evidence, to a map that identified more nuanced spatial understanding of the fall in PM2.5 levels across Morwell. It emerged almost by accident in Mr. Mitchell's evidence that there had in fact been a map discussed at a meeting that morning on the 28th of February, and we remain hopeful that that map will ultimately be produced to the inquiry. It is a map that provides a spatial depiction of travel blanket readings of PM2.5 levels, and if it is the map that we believe it is, does provide a clear basis for choosing Commercial Road as a dividing line. This proved to be a very divisive matter in the community, that suddenly this new suburb of South Morwell had been created and was seen and understood by the community as an arbitrary dividing line. It could, by reference to this travel blanket data plotted on a map, have been readily explained to the community, and in our submission it is a mystery why it was not.
And Ms. Richards, just on that point, if it is the map that we are thinking of, with the colours on it, it could also be a legend provided. So what does red mean, blue, green and green? So just that explanation of the colours on the map would also be greatly appreciated.
It would have been very helpful if the witnesses who generated that map had discussed its significance with us when they gave their evidence at the inquiry, but we'll continue to make that inquiry of those representing the state. Moving to the area of communications, although community meetings were an integral and in large part successful part of the fire service's good communications during the fire, the community meeting held on the 18th of February was an exception. There had been terrible conditions in Morwell over the weekend of the 15th and 16th of February, and in light of those conditions, more care should have been taken in setting up the meeting, ensuring that a skilled facilitator was available to run the meeting, and ensuring that there were representatives at the meeting who were able to provide authoritative information on behalf of the agencies they represented. There were guidelines in existence for setting up and running community meetings that Mr Rosen took Ms Tabane to last week. Had those guidelines been followed, the meeting on the 18th of February may not have been such an angry and disappointing event. Criticism in our submission should also be made of the bushfire smoke advisories issued by the EPA and the Chief Health Officer jointly throughout the fire. These were repetitive, poorly focused and really quite unhelpful, increasingly so as the fire went on. It was of little use to a person who lived in Morwell to be told that it was going to be smoky. The advice should have, in our submission, been better tailored to the actual conditions that were prevailing and the prolonged nature of the fire, and could have contained some more practical advice about measures to be taken to avoid the impact of the smoke. In similar vein, the health alerts and advisories issued by the Chief Health Officer that were targeted at health practitioners and service providers were also repetitive and did not actually contain information that assisted practitioners' advice to patients and clinical decision making. It's of little assistance to tell a practitioner that someone with asthma should follow their asthma plan when the practitioner is the person responsible for helping them devise and implement an asthma plan. A good deal of information provided to the community during the fire by the state and its agencies didn't, in our submission and in the opinion of the two communications experts who gave evidence, meet best practice in crisis communication, which requires, to put it simply, quick, consistent, open and empathetic public communications during a crisis. There are a couple of examples that I have drawn out in paragraph 9 of information sheets issued by the EPA and the Department of Health that pose questions. For example, the data on the EPA's website looks as though we've exceeded air quality standards. Is that right? And could the current smoke exposure affect my long-term health or that of my family? But then fail to provide answers. The answers to those questions are yes, and we don't know for sure, but we think it's unlikely. And those are answers that could be simply and clearly stated, and in our submission it created confusion and undid a lot of the good work that had been done in the communications area to provide information that was evasive and unhelpful and inconsistent with the experiences of people living in the community. The temporary relocation advice, of course, was more than just advice. It was a communication, and it was understandably seen by many in the community as inconsistent with earlier advice and also inconsistent with a bushfire smoke advisory issued by the EPA quoting the Chief Health Officer that very day. In our submission, advice that the best precaution to take was to stay out of the smoke, including by leaving town, could and should have been given from a much earlier stage in the fire. Finally, on the subject of communications, in our submission, GDF Sewers was conspicuous in its absence in public communications throughout the fire, and in its public utterances demonstrated little concern for the community and the effect that the fire was having on people living in the community. As Professor McNamara and Mr Drummond identified, this was contrary to best practice crisis communications, which requires those involved in a crisis to communicate quickly, consistently, openly and empathetically with those affected. In relation to schools and children's services, although the relocation of the Commercial Road Primary School and the Sacred Heart Primary School was relatively quick, and that's been commended, it remains the case that it could have been quicker. It wasn't necessary in our submission for those administering those schools to obtain advice, which almost appears to have been a sort of permission from the Chief Health Officer before making that decision. As it transpired, the advice that was given was advice during a conversation, followed up by an email that was not based on air quality data or a decision-making protocol, but on a second-hand report of the impact on children at a daycare centre close to these two schools. And in our submission, those administering those schools should have, like the Latrobe City Council did, assessed the conditions in the southern part of Morwell for themselves and made a call that they were plainly untenable for children and for staff and not conducive to quality education from the very beginning. Finally, in relation to relief and recovery, the eligibility criteria for the relocation and respite payments were not well articulated or explained. They appeared to be arbitrary and were inconsistently applied. A particular concern was the income requirement that was not clearly explained in public information issued by the Department of Human Services, and also the geographic criterion, which was a consequence of the advice issued by the Chief Health Officer that, as I've already submitted, was poorly explained. And finally, criticism needs to be made of the clean-up assistance package that was made available. Acknowledging that clean-up assistance of this sort is not ordinarily made available in the event of a fire or a flood, the self-clean package that was provided, a bucket with a mask and some gloves and a car wash voucher and a laundry voucher, was wholly inadequate to the scale of the cleaning task that faced members of the community. The council knew this and explained this to local government Victoria, including bringing them here to Morwell and taking them on a tour of various residences, but the clean-up package was fixed at state level and, as we have heard from community witnesses, was perceived to be inadequate. The clean-up assistance package was not announced until the 18th of March, more than a week after the fire had been declared controlled, and there were then further delays in implementing the assisted clean package because council had been unable to put those contracts out to tender until the package was announced. This really meant that the assistance provided was too little, too late. Many people had already made their own arrangements by the time the assistance package was made available. Moving then to the recommendations, and there are a number of them under the heading of environment and health. The first relates to the need for a national compliance standard for PM 2.5. In our submission, the Victorian Government should take the lead on this issue. There is an indication of an intention to develop a compliance standard in the gazettal notice that Ms Richardson referred to during her evidence with Dr Torre, and Council assisting accept the desirability of moving forward as a nation on this important issue. But there are limits, and if it can't be achieved within 12 months, then Victoria should take the lead and should, in our submission, establish its own state-based compliance standard, as indeed it did in relation to food safety laws some years ago. Additionally, in our submission, the board should recommend that the EPA undertake monitoring of PM 2.5 at all of its permanent monitoring stations in Victoria, which is something that it does not currently do. It's only very recently commenced monitoring PM 2.5 here in Traralgon, and it was not monitoring PM 2.5 in Traralgon at the time of the fire. One of the purposes for having an advisory standard in the National Environment Protection standards was to start the monitoring so that more information would be available for setting a compliance standard. And in order for that to happen, the monitoring must take place, and it would appear it has not. There was evidence before the board that there had previously been some discussion with the EPA about the need for air monitoring in Morwell as opposed to simply in Traralgon for the entire Latrobe Valley. And in our submission, an appropriate recommendation arising out of the experience of the fire this year is for the EPA to establish an automatic monitoring station in southern Morwell, close to the mine, to monitor a range of substances, but in particular fine particulate matter. Those readings should be available for the public, and that monitoring station should, in our submission, remain in place for at least 5 years. This is a project that the state could invite GDF Sewers to contribute to as part of its corporate social responsibility plan. Moving to the EPA's emergency response capacity, in our submission, the EPA should equip itself to be able to respond in an emergency rapidly with portable equipment that will enable it to provide reliable data for decision making within 28 hours at least, or at most, of an incident occurring. This is a recommendation that was put forward jointly by by Dr. Torre and Ms. Richardson, and it, in our submission, is a very sensible and relatively low-cost way for the EPA to be more prepared to respond in an emergency in future. Consistent also with suggestions made by Dr. Torre and Ms. Richardson, in recommendation or proposed recommendation 5, we've identified 2 research and development projects for the EPA. One relating to development of low-cost, simple ways for anyone in the community to measure and record airborne particulate matter. And the second is to build on the excellent Phoenix rapid fire prediction tool and produce an equivalent air quality prediction tool that can be used by emergency services in their decision making and planning and warnings.
We haven't mentioned there is the matter of planned burning, which can of course be a matter of concern to a variety of Victorian towns, and
including here in the Latrobe Valley, as we heard from Mr. Merritt. And of course that prediction tool would have an application to planned burning as well as to unplanned fires. The long-term health study, while welcome, at the moment is only proposed to be for an initial term of 10 years due to tendering requirements, as we understood the evidence. In our submission, that allows the tail to wag the dog, and the Department of Health should commit to at least a 20-year health study long-term health study and should put in place the contractual arrangements to give effect to that commitment. The study should, in our submission, have a governance structure that includes both community representatives and the Latrobe Valley Health Advocate, who I'll come to in a while, which should publish regular progress reports. It was notable during the course of this fire that very heavy reliance and with it some pressure was placed on the Chief Health Officer as the sole source of health advice during an emergency. In our submission there is capacity for that pressure to be alleviated by the establishment in advance of a public health emergency expert panel who can be available as a source of advice during an emergency on a range of different areas, whether it be communicable diseases or air quality issues or indeed anything else. This is a panel that could be established by the Emergency Management Commissioner and the Chief Health Officer in combination and could identify in advance of any incident occurring a range of expertise, both local, interstate and international. The next recommendation that we propose builds on the bushfire smoke protocol in a way suggested by Dr. Torre and Ms Richardson in their joint report. In light of the experience this February and March, in our submission it should now be possible to develop a more comprehensive Victorian smoke management guide that would comprise a suite of documents including various protocols that were developed and should be revised following the fire and information for employers to be developed by work cover. The next recommendation relates to the revision of the carbon monoxide protocol and the PM 2.5 protocol that were developed by the Department of Health and the EPA during the fire, and in particular revising the community carbon monoxide protocol so that it is consistent with the standard in place for firefighters. This should, in our submission, be done by the Emergency Management Commissioner and should be in place by the beginning of the fire season, the next fire season in November this year, and it should be reviewed by an independent expert panel. The next recommendation proposed is that the Victorian Work Cover Authority should develop and publish information for employers about occupational air quality standards, including the standards, the compliance standards that are set by reference to the Safe Work Australia Hazardous Substances Information System. The board will recall that information was provided by WorkSafe to employers in extremely general terms, and there are in fact occupational standards that are referenced in the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, and it would be of assistance to tell employers what those are and to give them some practical advice about how to ensure that they're being complied with. The next recommendation arises from suggestions made by board members and in particular Professor Catford in discussion with Professor Brooke and Dr. Lester. It is notorious that health outcomes in the Latrobe Valley are worse than those for the remainder of Victoria. The smoke from the mine fire in February and March this year added insult to an already poor situation. In our submission, this is an opportunity to take that insult and turn it into a basis for improvement of health outcomes in the Latrobe Valley. And this could be done by declaring the Latrobe Valley a health conservation area and appointing a person in whom the community has confidence as a health advocate for the Latrobe Valley. That person would, as we have already submitted, have a defined role in relation to the long-term health study, but could act as a champion for improved health in the Latrobe Valley more generally. The next series of recommendations relate to communications, and I'll touch on these fairly quickly. The first is that Emergency Management Victoria should take the lead in ensuring that all agencies involved in emergency response have the capability and resources that they need to respond with effective public communications during an emergency. And this can include a range of matters. It should include training in crisis communication. It should also include the availability of specialist communication staff to provide rapid assistance during a complex and prolonged incident. Members of the board will recall that Ms Tabane spoke about her assessment that it would have been helpful to have a senior and more experienced communications practitioner here on the ground in the Latrobe Valley at a much earlier stage in the incident. And the third matter is the development of communications capabilities in all media and all forums. Everything from facilitating community meetings and having trained facilitators available for that kind of communication to effective use of social media to inform the community during an incident. The next recommendation that's proposed arises from Mr Lapsley's evidence about the importance of a community engagement model for emergency management planning and is also consistent with what is written in the Victorian Emergency Management Reform White Paper on community engagement. It should be an integral component of emergency management planning so that if and when an incident occurs, trusted networks in a community are already known and are already available to emergency services as a means of communicating with the community. The next two recommendations relate to GDF sewers. The first concerns the need to include a private operator of essential infrastructure, such as GDF sewers, in the coordination of public communications during an incident. There was quite an elaborate coordination process for communications by public sector agencies, and GDF sewers were not included in that, and Mr Harkins accepted when I put to him that that would have been useful. And then finally, arising out of the reports of Professor McNamara and Mr Drummond, in our submission, GDF sewers should review its own crisis management communication strategy in line with international best practice. So those are the recommendations proposed in relation to environment and health. Unless there are any questions, I propose to give Mr Rosen a turn now, and he will address the board in relation to firefighter safety and also in relation to the very critical subject area of mitigation and prevention.
The present inquiry is the third major Victorian inquiry in recent years to consider firefighter safety. Board may recall Mr Lapsley's evidence about the challenges that confront emergency organisations in relation to what can be sometimes conflicting legal obligations, the duty on them to suppress fire and at the same time the duty on them to protect the firefighters who they are deliberately deploying into harm's way. In that respect, emergency services are unusual as an employer in in having to comply with their obligations under legislation in those circumstances. The evidence before the inquiry indicates that a very large number of firefighters were deployed to the firefight at the Hazelwood Mine. No lives were lost amongst the firefighters, many of whom worked in very hazardous and difficult circumstances, and further no serious injuries were suffered other than by one MFB firefighter who suffered complications from a cut to his hand that necessitated a number of surgical interventions. It's pleasing to note, having regard to that evidence, that a number of the recommendations from the earlier inquiries, that is the Linton bushfire inquiry in 2002 and the Royal Commission in 2009 into the Black Saturday bushfires, a number of the recommendations from those earlier inquiries were implemented at Hazelwood. For example, the agencies made extensive use of safety officers, a matter that I will return to. The firefight at the mine was complex and vast, and as my learned friend Ms Richards has noted, the fire was very difficult to extinguish. The fire exposed both firefighters and employees to serious health hazards, and first and foremost, and the focus of these submissions will be the exposure of those firefighters and mine employees to carbon monoxide. The evidence before the inquiry is that 14 firefighters presented at a hospital for carbon monoxide exposure. A number of those incidents, most of them were notified to the Victorian Work Cover Authority under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The inquiry will recall the evidence it heard from the two volunteer firefighters, Mr Lawler and Mr Steely, who were amongst the first firefighters to attend at Hazelwood on the 9th of February. Mr Steely in particular referred to the effect of the fire on his health and the health of other members of his local brigade, the Hayfield Brigade. He thought that 6 members of that brigade alone had suspected carbon monoxide poisoning. In addition, there were 12 mine staff who were sent to hospital as a result of high carbon monoxide readings. None of this should have been a surprise because brown coal fires are notorious for emitting carbon monoxide due to the incomplete combustion that occurs. And the board will remember Professor Cliff's detailed examination of the way in which brown coal fires burn, and also community witness Mr Galton gave evidence about that too. Equally well known are the harmful effects of carbon monoxide. The board has evidence from Dr Torre of the EPA and also Dr Lester and Professor Campbell. Dr Torre explained that inhaling high levels of carbon monoxide can cause headache, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, blurred vision, confusion, chest pain, weakness, heart failure and difficulty breathing. He also noted that breathing lower levels of carbon monoxide during pregnancy can lead to slower than normal mental development of the child. Finally, he noted that prolonged exposure at lower levels can cause tissue damage, and people suffering from cardiovascular or lung diseases are more vulnerable to the toxic effects of carbon monoxide. There are also well-established workplace exposure standards for carbon monoxide. These are promulgated by Safe Work Australia and include an exposure standard for carbon monoxide, that is workplace exposure standard, calculated on an 8-hour time-weighted average of 30 parts per million. And there are also short-term exposure limits, which are set out in paragraph 8 of the proposed findings of our outline. Given that the brown coal fires are notorious for emitting carbon monoxide and that the deleterious health effects of carbon monoxide exposure are well established, and that there was an established exposure standard as at February 2014, it's somewhat surprising that the emergency services had so much difficulty, as the evidence indicates, in grappling with this problem. Reports into previous fires at the Hazelwood mine had referred to these dangers and to the need for there to be in place appropriate procedures to deal with carbon monoxide exposure. To pick just 2 of those reports that are in evidence, there was a report prepared for GDF sewers by its consultants GHD into the 2006 fire, and it recommended that a procedure for dealing with carbon monoxide during firefighting, including the use of carbon monoxide monitors, should be developed, since personnel safety is a major responsibility and concern in fighting coal fires. There was also a separate report prepared by the CFA into that same fire, focusing on its firefighters, and after noting at page 30 of the report that a number of firefighters fighting the 2006 fire were overcome by carbon monoxide exposure, the report states any similar fires in this environment in the future will require the careful management of this now known risk. Unfortunately, as with much of what was learnt in reports prepared in relation to previous fires, and I'll return to this topic in relation to mitigation and prevention, not all of the lessons that should have been learnt from those earlier fires and earlier reports were learnt. Mr Steely, volunteer firefighter Steely, told the inquiry that he was provided with some basic advice about carbon monoxide exposure when he was deployed to the mine on the night of the 9th of February. He was given a carbon monoxide monitor. He was told if it beeps once, you've got 8 hours of time in the area before you have any ill effects. If it beeps continuously, get out. In the first incident action plan, that was a hand-drawn document that the board will recall hearing evidence about, Station Officer Ross Mail from the Morwell station did address in broad terms the issue of carbon monoxide exposure, and he's to be commended for recognising at that very early stage the need for there to be appropriate protection provided to the firefighters. The incident action plan noted that health monitoring and hazmat detection team to monitor carbon monoxide levels of personnel as required, but it didn't identify exposure levels other than noting that there should be total withdrawal at 200 parts per million. What the evidence reveals is that over the following 3 or 4 days, there were what could probably best be described as faltering attempts to come to grips with this issue, which ultimately resulted in a documented procedure or protocol that was in place on the 14th of February, some 5 days into the firefight at the mine. We've set out in the outline those developments which started on the 11th of February with a reference to a peak reading of 150 parts per million, with that being a trigger for withdrawal to what was referred to as a clean area. And then on the same day, following presentation at Sale Hospital of a number of firefighters complaining of exposure to carbon monoxide, the incident controller ceased firefighting at the mine pending a review of safe work arrangements. On the following day, there was implemented an upgraded system of work to manage the risk of carbon monoxide exposure, and Mr Lapsley explains in his second statement the components of that protocol. Firstly, crew leaders would wear personal carbon monoxide monitoring devices and monitor carbon monoxide levels in the surrounding atmosphere. The readings would be reported every 15 minutes. Where atmospheric carbon monoxide measured over 50 parts per million, firefighters would wear breathing apparatus for the maximum time allowed. It will be recalled that the Safe Work Australia exposure standard is 30 parts per million. Finally, where atmospheric carbon monoxide measured over 75 parts per million, firefighters would don breathing apparatus and leave the area. The inquiry has heard that there were practical difficulties associated with the use of breathing apparatus in the context of this particular firefight. Those difficulties stemmed from the considerable distances that firefighters had to travel from the staging area to the places in the mine where they were deployed, and the limited amount of time that you can actually work wearing breathing apparatus. That came to the attention of the fire services on the 13th of February, which was also the day that there was a hazmat declaration made in relation to the fire by the State Controller. On the following day, the 14th of February, a documented health management and decontamination plan became operational. There's already been some reference made to that in the context of community carbon monoxide exposure earlier today. At page 17 of the plan, there was a table that set out safety zones and action levels, and the table stated that the levels were designed to minimise the risk of personnel exceeding the biological exposure limit of 5% carboxyhemoglobin. It stated that at carbon monoxide concentrations below 30 parts per million, that is the Safe Work Australia exposure standard, firefighters could work in what was referred to as standard personal protective equipment, or P2 respirators. Where there were readings between 30 and 50 parts per million, the table states as per site self-contained breathing apparatus crew rotation procedure, and where there were readings over 50 parts per million, the document stated as per site procedure for essential works. There was further explanation of this at page 15 of the protocol, of that plan rather. It will be recalled that the inquiry heard from Commander Kadzikas of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade Hazmat Unit. He gave evidence both about the issue of firefighter safety and also, as Ms Richards has already referred today, about community exposure to carbon monoxide. Commander Kadzikas is a highly experienced fire officer. It will be recalled that he's been at the brigade for many years, in fact attended the Coot Island incident in 1990, I think it's the correct date. He was deployed to Hazelwood Incident Management Team on the 15th and 16th of February as a Deputy Incident Controller, and he gave evidence, importantly, of a carbon monoxide protocol that he oversaw, which differed from the one described as operational by Mr Lapsley. And it will be recalled that Board Member Catford Professor Catford drew this to Mr Lapsley's attention and asked him if there is a potential for confusion among firefighters in circumstances where there's apparently conflicting advice and changing plans, which seem a bit on the run from our perspective, that is the Board's perspective. Mr Lapsley agreed and recognised that this was the result of the absence of what he referred to as a solid plan. That 14th of February 2014 plan or protocol governed the management of carbon monoxide exposure at the mine from the time it was promulgated right through to the conclusion of the firefight. The inquiry has before it in evidence a submission from the United Firefighters Union, and in the submission the union has raised a number of concerns with the above developments. The submission points out that the protocols were not consistently applied and were difficult to apply in practice. Importantly, the UFU submission draws to the attention of the inquiry some advice that was received early on in the development of the exposure plan from an occupational hygienist, Mr Robert Golick of Amcosh Proprietary Limited. In a letter of advice provided to the Metropolitan Fire Brigade on the 13th of February, Mr Golick raised serious concerns about the way in which carbon monoxide exposure was being managed at the mine. In particular, he queried whether the 5% carboxyhemoglobin level was an appropriate limit to use. He suggested a limit of 2.5 to 3% in line with the Safe Work Australia exposure standard. And importantly, what Mr Golick said in that letter echoes to some extent what was advised to the EPA and the Department of Health about the community protocol. That is, about the standards being set too high for an event of this description, or this duration, I should say. Mr Lapsley's evidence before the inquiry is that Mr Golick's advice was not followed in its entirety by the emergency services for the reasons explained in his statement and expanded upon in evidence in the inquiry. But from the perspective of counsel assisting, just as the position with community exposure of carbon monoxide was not explained satisfactorily to the inquiry, nor was this aspect of the evidence explained satisfactorily either, and I will return to that in the recommendations that are proposed in this part of the inquiry. Before leaving these issues, it's important to note that the Firefighters Union has made a complaint to the Victorian Work Cover Authority, the regulator of health and safety in this state, about these matters, and has asked the Work Cover Authority to investigate if the CFA and the MFB complied with the Occupational Health and Safety Act in relation to the management of this issue. The inquiry should note that in response to that letter, the Chief Executive of the Work Cover Authority wrote to the union and advised that the union's letter had been, quote, referred to the enforcement group for a comprehensive investigation to be undertaken in relation to the allegations raised by the union to establish whether any contraventions of the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2004 have occurred. Another aspect of the evidence before the inquiry that is relevant to the issue of firefighter safety is a draft standard operating procedure, SOP, entitled the Trobe Valley Open Coal Mines Response to Fires. This draft SOP was placed before the inquiry by Mr Lapsley, and an examination of it reveals that it contains a detailed protocol for managing carbon monoxide exposure, albeit that it was in draft form and not formalised. It sets out the importance of bringing to the attention of firefighters the dangers of carbon monoxide and the adverse conditions likely to be encountered, and it also makes reference to pre-existing medical conditions that might mean that particular firefighters are more vulnerable to carbon monoxide exposure than others. Disturbingly, the draft before the inquiry bears the date 29 April 2010. It was nearly 4 years old at the time of the February 2014 fire and still in draft form. Given the recognition in the CFA report into the 2006 fire of the need to implement just such a protocol for the management of this serious health and safety risk, it is deeply concerning that the SOP had not been finalised and implemented prior to the 9th of February 2014. It's clear that had it been finalised and implemented, the problems that were experienced, particularly during the first week of trying to have in place appropriate procedures and developing them on the run in the context of a very difficult firefight, could have been avoided. Mr Lapsley was candid in his concession that the best explanation for the failure to finalise that draft SOP was that it hadn't been a priority of the CFA to have it signed off. He accepted on an issue of such importance that was not good enough, and that in light of the experience of earlier fires, the procedures should have been in place, ready to be rolled out immediately the firefight in the mine commenced. Another aspect of the evidence before the inquiry is that there would appear to be inadequate, perhaps non-existent, procedures in place for the fire agencies, particularly the CFA, to be aware of whether or not its volunteer firefighters may have pre-existing conditions that mean that they either should not be deployed to coal mine fires, or at least they should be provided with information to enable a personal judgment to be made about whether or not deployment is a good idea. It was noted earlier that there are categories of people, and therefore categories of firefighters, that are particularly susceptible to suffering ill effects from carbon monoxide. These include pregnant women or women of childbearing age, and those with pre-existing heart or respiratory conditions, and there is also some evidence before the inquiry that smokers are a vulnerable group as a result of their higher than normal pre-existing carbon monoxide blood levels. The evidence before the inquiry is that the CFA has no records of the pre-existing health of its volunteers. The position is different in relation to its career firefighters, where records of health background are available. This is clearly a cause for concern that the CFA deploys its volunteer firefighters to mine fires where they're likely to be exposed to carbon monoxide without any knowledge of any pre-existing susceptibility those volunteers may have. This matter was raised with Mr Lapsley, the Fire Services Commissioner, and his response was that historically the approach that had been taken was that volunteers with such conditions were required to self-manage. The evidence of the two volunteers the inquiries heard from, Mr Lawler and Mr Steely, was that they were provided with little, if any, information in advance of their deployment to the mine. It will be recalled that they were both from brigades some distance from Morwell, and that they had no personal prior experience of fighting fires in mines and knew little of what they were in for, if I can put it that way. It's clear that any decision to self-manage has to be an informed decision. That is, for self-management to work, the person who is self-managing must have a full understanding of the risks involved. Clearly, the deployment of firefighters in these vulnerable groups to a firefight where they're likely to be exposed to carbon monoxide compromises potentially the health and safety of those firefighters, but also of their colleagues who might have to attend and evacuate an affected firefighter. We also note that in addition to carbon monoxide exposure, there were other safety issues that arose in the context of a firefight for firefighters, including batter stability and water contamination, and there is evidence in Mr Lapsley's statement and also the statement of Mr Kelly from WorkSafe about the way in which those risks were managed. Turning to the question of carbon monoxide exposure, management of that risk by GDF Sewers in relation to its own employees. It was noted earlier that a number of GDF Sewers mine employees were also hospitalised due to carbon monoxide exposure. It was also noted that the recommendation from the 2006 fire report squarely raised the need for the development of a procedure for dealing with carbon monoxide for mine workers, just as it did in relation to firefighters. The 2008 report, that is 2 years after that fire, noted that the recommendation about the development of a carbon monoxide protocol within GDF Sewers had only been partly implemented. And there's evidence before the inquiry from Mr Dugan that that was a reference to a page in the mine fire instructions that addressed this issue in general terms. Mr Harkins, it will be recalled, said that in accordance with those instructions, mine workers were provided with carbon monoxide monitors, canaries, he called them, during the firefight, and they were also required to comply with the CFA's testing regimes, which have been discussed above. Mr Harkins conceded that the instructions that were in place for GDF Sewers employees in February of this year were extremely general. He accepted that there was definitely room for improvement in GDF Sewers' management of carbon monoxide exposure. It's perhaps fortunate that GDF Sewers was able to provide protection to its own employees by piggybacking, in a sense, on the CFA's procedures that were in place from the 14th of February. The final aspect of the factual findings that Council Assisting Submit ought to be made in relation to this topic concerns the attendance of the Victorian Work Cover Authority at the mine in response to notifications to it that mine workers had been suffering from carbon monoxide exposure. Those notifications are attached to Mr Kelly's statement, and it will be recalled that Mr Kelly, who heads up the Earth Resources unit within Work Cover, that is the unit responsible for the regulation of health and safety in mines, told the inquiry that there had been visits to the mine on the 14th of February and also the 21st of February, where Work Cover inspectors were dealing specifically with this issue of carbon monoxide exposure. On at least one, and no, in fact both of those occasions, the Earth Resources Unit Inspector was accompanied by an occupational hygienist, Mr Grayson, who is also an employee of WorkCover, albeit not part of that unit but part of their general inspectorate. Mr Kelly was not personally involved in those inspections, and in those circumstances was unable to advise the inquiry about what standards were being used by WorkCover inspectors in assessing whether the arrangements in place were sufficient and adequate to meet the obligations of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The inquiry was subsequently provided with a letter which informed it that the standards were the Safe Work Australia exposure standards, the 30 parts per million level that was referred to earlier. On each occasion that the WorkCover inspectors attended, they were satisfied that what was in place complied with the requirements of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And it's already been noted that there is an ongoing investigation by WorkCover's enforcement group in relation to that matter. Turning then to the commendations that Council assisting submit are appropriate to be made in this matter. The first is that the CFA, the MFB and GDF sewers are to be commended for deploying air carbon monoxide and carboxyhemoglobin monitoring for firefighters once the risk of the exposure of firefighters and mine employees to carbon monoxide was detected. As with a number of the commendations that we submit ought to be made in respect of environment monitoring and health matters, it's important to recognise what was done, but at the same time noting that it was in some respects too little, too late, and it was done on the run. I'll return to that in relation to the criticisms we say ought to be made. The second commendation returns to the question of safety officers, and it is very pleasing to see, especially after the evidence that was led at the Black Saturday Royal Commission, where so many incident management teams were set up without safety officers, that having regard to the important role safety officers play under the AIMS system, here at this firefight, with the possible exception of the first 2 days, the 9th and 10th of February, all of the incident management teams made extensive use of safety officers and advisors to assist in addressing these difficult issues, and for that the fire agencies are commended. It will be recalled that Mr Lapsley gave evidence at the end of the first week of the inquiry that there remains an issue about there being sufficient numbers of properly trained safety officers within the fire agencies, and he indicated to the inquiry that that's a matter that's firmly on his agenda, and it's pleasing to see that that's a matter that continues to be addressed, as it's obviously very important in this area. Turning then to the criticisms that Council assisting submit would be made. The first is that the Country Fire Authority should have responded well before February 2014 to the recommendations in its 2007 report into the 2006 fire at the Hazelwood Mine by developing a procedure for dealing with exposure to carbon monoxide during firefighting. It should not have been the case that this procedure was being developed alongside having to deal with a very difficult and vast firefight at the mine. Similarly, GDF Sewers should have had in place a comprehensive procedure for managing the exposure of its employees to carbon monoxide during a mine fire. And finally, in responding to carbon monoxide exposure at the Hazelwood Mine Fire, the fire agencies demonstrated poor communication, confusion, policy on the run and suboptimal responses. And in the proposed findings, we have detailed the basis for that criticism. Turning then to the recommendations that Council assisting submit ought to be made in relation to firefighter safety. The first is that the Emergency Management Commissioner should, with the assistance of the Chief Health Officer, the EPA and WorkCover, develop a firefighting carbon monoxide protocol. The protocol ought to be finalised by November 2014, and so it would be in place for the forthcoming fire season. Before being finalised, the protocol should be reviewed by an independent panel appointed by the Emergency Management Commissioner, and the protocol should specify the types of monitoring equipment to be used, frequency and types of locations suitable for monitoring, how the results will be assessed to provide information for decision making, the trigger levels for action for the general community and those in specific risk categories, and response actions according to each trigger level. Importantly, the firefighting carbon monoxide protocol should be developed in tandem with the community carbon monoxide protocol, which is recommendation 9 in the environmental and health section referred to earlier. Once finalised, it should be widely disseminated in the Victorian coal mining industry and other industries in which carbon monoxide poisoning is likely to occur in a fire or similar situation. Second recommendation is that GDF sewers should adopt and apply the firefighting carbon monoxide protocol. And finally, the CFA, MFB and GDF sewers should highlight the risks of carbon monoxide poisoning to firefighters with pre-existing respiratory or cardiac conditions or who may be pregnant. This should occur during recruitment, selection, training and deployment of both employed and volunteer firefighters at the start of each fire season. To address the knowledge gap identified earlier, firefighters should be encouraged to self-disclose if they have a pre-existing respiratory or cardiac condition, or if they are a female of childbearing age, whether they are or could be pregnant. Before deploying in an incident, firefighters should again be reminded of these risks. A short educational video should be developed and made available, and it will be recalled there was evidence that such a video could be played, for example, in the staging area before firefighters are deployed onto the fire ground. Unless any members of the board have any questions about those matters, I'll move on to the fourth topic, which is mitigation and prevention. As Ms Richards has already indicated, mitigation and prevention of fires in mines is obviously a crucially important topic. The third of the terms of reference that the board has to consider is the adequacy and effectiveness of the application and administration of relevant regulatory regimes in relation to the risk of and response to fire at the Hazelwood coal mine. The board may recall the evidence of Professor Cliff in relation to the difficulties associated with putting out brown coal mine fires, as if it was necessary given all of the other evidence about the difficulties faced by the fire agencies here. Professor Cliff's response to those difficulties in his report was quite a simple one, and that is it's far better to avoid brown coal mine fires than have to try and work out how to put them out. As Richard said earlier, that the best way to address a coal mine fire is to put it out early, and of course that's true, but without wanting to be seen to disagree with my learned leader, the best way to deal with a brown coal mine fire is not to have them in the first place, and that's why prevention is obviously so important. In this part of our submissions, we set out in the same manner the proposed findings that ought to be made, as well as commendations, criticisms and recommendations. Because of the complexity of the regulatory regime that exists in Victoria, the proposed findings are quite lengthy, but it is important to have a proper understanding of the regulatory framework. If I can start then with the regulatory framework in relation to the regulation of mines. As we know, mining in Victoria is regulated under the Mineral Resources Sustainable Development Act, and one of the purposes of that Act is to establish a legal framework aimed at ensuring that the health and safety of the public is protected in relation to work being done under a licence. The board will have noted that there was a deal of evidence given by Ms White from the Mine Regulator and Mr Neist from the Work Cover Authority about their attitudes to regulation of the risk of mine fires, and I will return to that. But it's important not to lose sight of that basic starting point that the legislation that regulates mining has as one of its objects the protection of the health and safety of the public in relation to work being done under a mining licence. The principal form of regulation under that Act is a licensing regime, and we know that GDF Sewers has held a licence since 1996, a 30-year licence. The Act is regulated by the Earth Resources Regulation Branch of the Department of State Development, Business and Innovation, DSDBI, and in accordance with the manner that the issue was approached earlier in the inquiry, I'll refer to that branch as the Mine Regulator, whilst noting that since the 1st of January 2008, the Victorian Work Cover Authority has also had a role as the regulator for occupational health and safety in mines. In addition, for the requirement to be licensed, the Act under Section 40, the Mineral Resources Sustainable Development Act, requires a licensee to have an approved work plan to undertake mining work. The head of the department approves a work plan which may be varied and conditions may be imposed about the way in which work is carried out. The evidence indicates that until 2010 there was a requirement for a work plan to address occupational health and safety. That requirement was removed from the relevant regulations in that year as part of the transfer of responsibility for regulating occupational health and safety in mines from the Mine Regulator to Work Cover, and I will return to that issue. The Mine Regulator was asked what its responsibility was in relation to mitigating the risk of fire in open-cut mines. And the answer given by Ms White on behalf of the Mine Regulator was very clear. It has none, she told the inquiry. According to Ms White, the lead agency for managing fire risk in the worked-out matters of the mine is the Work Cover Authority. Turning then to the role that the Work Cover Authority plays under the regulations in operation in Victoria, it's fair to say that the regulation of occupational health and safety in mines in Victoria, the history of that regulation is complex. Ms White's statement sets out in some detail. Of particular significance to this inquiry is a report commissioned by the Victorian Government in 2006, which recommended the transfer of regulatory responsibility for OHS in mines from the Mine Regulator, where it sat at that time, to the Work Cover Authority. And the inquiry has before it a copy of that report by Neil Pope. And in the report, the recommendations of which were accepted by the government, Mr Pope recommended that transfer and it took effect on the 1st of January 2008. It's important to note that the principal piece of legislation administered by Work Cover, the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2004, includes a very different regulatory model from that which exists under the Mining Act. It's not predicated on licensing and approval of work plans. As Mr Neist explained to the inquiry, the Executive Director of Health and Safety at the Work Cover Authority, the Act is based on what he called the Robins model of regulation, a reference to an English report from 1970, and the adoption of this model, Mr Neist told us, involved a shift from detailed prescriptive standards to a more self-regulatory and performance-based approach. And as he explained it, instead of prescribing how to do or not to do something, the Act requires the owner of the risk, referred to as the duty holder, to take responsibility to achieve the desired outcome. And we recall that Mr Neist, in his evidence, referred to the owner of the risk being required to manage it in accordance with the regulatory scheme. For present purposes, the main provision of the Occupational Health and Safety Act is Section 23, and because there has been a deal of evidence about it, it's probably worth reminding ourselves of its contents. It provides that an employer must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, that persons other than employees of the employer are not exposed to risks to their health or safety arising from the conduct of the undertaking of the employer. Necessary to briefly refer to two other provisions of the Act to better understand that. The first is Section 20, which addresses the concept of reasonably practicable, and it provides that where a duty such as Section 23 requires a person to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, health and safety, that requires the person to eliminate risks to health and safety so far as is reasonably practicable, and if it's not reasonably practicable, to eliminate risks to health and safety, to reduce those risks so far as is reasonably practicable. And finally, there is a principle of health and safety protection in Section 4, to which reference should briefly be made, which is as follows. The importance of health and safety requires that employees, other persons at work and members of the public be given the highest level of protection against risk to their health and safety that is reasonably practicable in the circumstances. With that understanding, or brief understanding of the Act in mind, it's necessary to look briefly at the evidence before the inquiry about how work cover sees those provisions applying in the circumstances of the subject matter of the inquiry, a mine in the worked out part of the, a fire in the worked out part of the Hazelwood mine. Mr Neist was asked about the application of Section 23 to the fire before the inquiry. His evidence on the issue it is submitted is difficult to follow and appears to be internally contradictory. He was asked a direct question about WorkCover's view about whether the 2014 mine fire arose from the conduct of the undertaking of the operator of the mine, and his unambiguous answer was no. He explained that that view is because, and I quote, the undertaking is to extract brown coal from the earth and transport the brown coal to a power station. There is nothing in that conduct that caused the fire, unquote. Counsel assisting submits that this seems to be an unduly narrow approach to the operation of Section 23 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Surprisingly, it also seems to be inconsistent with what the inquiry has been told is an ongoing investigation into the fire that is being conducted by the Victorian Work Cover Authority itself. There is before the inquiry a statement from Mr Watson, who's the Manager of Investigations of the Victorian Work Cover Authority, and he's advised the inquiry that Work Cover has commenced an investigation into the fires that burned at the mine. It seems that there are two parallel investigations being carried out by Work Cover, the one relating to carbon monoxide exposure, focusing on whether or not the fire agencies met their duty under the Act, and also an investigation into the fire itself, presumably to determine if GDF Sewers met its obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. These matters are certainly of far more than passing interest to the inquiry, because the application of Section 23 is highly significant as it defines the regulatory reach of the Victorian Work Cover Authority in relation to risks to public safety as a result of mine fires. It's recognised that Work Cover's role must necessarily be limited by Section 23 of the Act. If Mr Neist's narrow view, what counsel assisting say is a narrow view of Section 23 is accepted, that the Act does not apply to fires in worked out parts of the mine, then it follows that there may well be a gap in the regulatory framework. That is because of the clear evidence given to the inquiry by Ms White from the mine regulator about the mine regulator's attitude to the regulation of mine fires. That is, that it's the province of the Victorian Work Cover Authority. It seems to counsel assisting that there are two issues here that need to be grappled with. There's a legal issue about the construction of Section 23, and there's a factual issue about whether, having regard to that construction, the evidence before the inquiry indicates that a fire in the worked out matters of the mine falls within Section 23. We submit the legal issue is relatively straightforward. Without going into the detail of the cases that have interpreted Section 23, those cases indicate, we submit, that Section 23 and also equivalent provisions in other similar statutes have been interpreted broadly and in a manner that is consistent with the objects of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. They also indicate, we submit, that generally speaking, where an activity or event occurs at the place at which the undertaking is carried out, it will be considered to arise from the conduct of the undertaking. And we have referred in our submissions at footnote 27 to the relevant cases as we see them. We also submit that the factual issue identified is not particularly complex. The northern batters of the mine, as the extensive evidence before the inquiry shows, are in no sense non-operational. It's been explained by witnesses such as Mr Faithful of GDF Sewers, the extensive infrastructure on and around the northern batters, for example, high voltage power lines, pipes, watering systems and geotechnical monitoring equipment, is integral to the mine's operations. The presence of this infrastructure is said to be one of the main reasons why the area cannot be rehabilitated prior to the end of mining operations. Counsel assisting submit that despite the evidence of Mr Neist, the inquiry should conclude that the risks to public safety that arose from the fire in the worked-out northern batters of the Hazelwood Mine are risks that arose from the conduct of the undertaking of GDF Sewers. However, even if that submission were to be accepted by the inquiry, in the light of the evidence of Mr Neist of the Work Cover Authority and Ms White of the Mine Regulator, it is still necessary to consider the important question of whether there is a gap in the regulation of mines in Victoria. Mr Neist was asked directly if he thought there is a regulatory gap, and he said, and I quote, "Yes, there may be." In fairness, he subsequently gave evidence which seemed to suggest that he thought there may not be a gap, but ultimately he recognised that any such gap needed to be filled. He was asked directly who the regulator was in respect of public safety that was unrelated to the conduct of the mine's undertaking, and he told the inquiry that he was unaware of the identity of the regulator in relation to that matter. Counsel assisting submit that on the basis of the evidence before the inquiry and a proper understanding of the regulatory regime, that there is a gap in the regulatory regime, although it's perhaps not as wide as would be the case if one accepted Mr Neist's narrow interpretation of the operation of Section 23. We'll return to what should be done about filling the gap in the recommendations that we propose ought to be made. Before doing that, it's necessary to say a little about Part 5.3 of the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations 2007. It's been noted that the Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, imposes duties on employers, including, of course, GDF Sewers, but there are also duties imposed by the regulations, and they are important in the context of this inquiry. The starting point is a recognition that the mine is a prescribed mine for the purposes of the regulations, and what that means is that it must comply both with the general requirements set out in Part 5.3, which apply to all mines, whether prescribed or not, as well as the more onerous obligations that are imposed only on prescribed mines. Under those provisions, GDF Sewers was and is required to identify all mining hazards at the mine and to assess the risks to health or safety of any person associated with those hazards, to adopt risk control measures that eliminate, so far as is reasonably practicable, any risks to health and safety, or, if it's not reasonably practicable to eliminate such risks, it is required to reduce those risks so far as is reasonably practicable. It is also required to review and, if necessary, revise each of, and that should read A to D there in paragraph E, above, after any incident involving a mining hazard occurs at the mine. And finally, it's required to conduct a comprehensive and systematic safety assessment of all major mining hazards. The inquiry heard evidence about major mining hazards. What is clear is that a fire or explosion that could cause a risk to health or safety is included in the definition of a mining hazard under the regulations. It's submitted that this clearly included and includes a fire in the worked out parts of the mine. Such fires may also be major mining hazards in that they have the potential to cause an incident that would cause or pose a significant risk of it causing more than one death. As the evidence before the inquiry indicates, the difference between a major mining hazard and a mining hazard is not always an easy distinction to apply in practice. The evidence before the inquiry is that the Work Cover Authority has concentrated its regulatory approach on compliance by GDF sewers with Regulation 5.3.23 in relation to mine fires that meet the definition of major mining hazards. The inquiry will recall that Inspector Hayes of Work Cover was one of a team of 3 who carried out an audit at the mine in 2012 in relation to this matter. He issued an improvement notice as a result of the findings of the audit, requiring GDF sewers to comply with Regulation 5.3.23, and some months later, when he returned to the mine in October 2012, he concluded that there had been compliance. In his evidence before this inquiry, he conceded that he may not have checked on compliance with all aspects of Regulation 5.3.23, and in particular, an examination of the documents produced in response to the improvement notice suggests that there hasn't been, that the matters set out in Regulation 5.3.23 4C to E about the process by which risk controls were determined is not addressed in that material. In his report to the inquiry, Professor Cliff, a health and safety in mining expert from the University of Queensland, questioned whether GDF sewers had complied with the regulation. However, it is noted that he modified his view on this matter in light of further information provided to him after his report was completed. Crucially, for this inquiry, Council assisting submit that there is no evidence that as part of its attempt to comply with Part 5.3 of the regulations, GDF sewers assessed the risk of a fire in the worked out batters of the mine as required by Regulation 5.3.7. Whatever may be the position in relation to compliance with Regulation 5.3.23 concerning major mining hazards, Council assisting submit that there is a question about compliance with Regulation 5.3.7 in relation to the assessment of risks and appropriate controls being put in place to deal with the risk of fires in the worked out batters or worked out parts of the mine. As Professor Cliff explained, the failure to address this issue seems to be because the focus of GDF sewers was on multiple fatality under the major mining hazard definition. Professor Cliff's attention was drawn to the evidence of Mr Polmere of GDF sewers about minimum compliance with the Fire Service Code, a matter to which I'll return. Professor Cliff's response to that was compliance with the code is not thinking, you just follow the recipe. It doesn't evaluate the risk or the effectiveness of anything, it's just do as you're told. Council assisting submit that the evidence before the inquiry suggests that GDF sewers did not assess the risks associated with fire in the worked out batters of the mine in accordance with Regulation 5.3.71, did not control those risks in accordance with Regulation 5.3.73, and as a result failed to review those measures after the fire in a non-operational part of the mine in September 2008, as it was required to do by Regulation 5.3.92b. What is particularly concerning is that the internal investigation into the September 2008 fire conducted for GDF sewers by consultants GHD highlighted the need for this very risk to be addressed. At page 4 of that report, its authors, GHD, noted that, and I quote, the significant factor in this fire, that is the 2008 fire, was the escalation into an uncontrollable fire within a short time due to mine personnel being unable to mount an effective initial response as the non-operational areas have very difficult access and there were insufficient firefighting facilities available. End quote. That finding informed a recommendation that was made to GDF sewers, recommendation 6, which was, and I quote, "A risk assessment should be undertaken on the non-operational areas to determine if further prevention work is required. The risk assessment should include a cost-benefit analysis." Given that on the evidence before the inquiry there are some obvious similarities between the 2008 fire and the 2014 fires, it is of considerable concern that GDF Sewers did not conduct such a risk assessment as was recommended. Had it been done and appropriate control measures implemented in accordance with the outcome of the assessment and the requirements of the regulations to which reference has been made, the 2014 fires in the worked out areas of the mine may not have occurred. Even if they had occurred, they may not have had the catastrophic impact that they in fact had. The evidence before the inquiry, we submit, establishes that a risk assessment of the non-operational areas of the mine was not undertaken between December 2008 and the 9th of February this year. This is notwithstanding the recommendation to do it that I've referred to, but also an internal audit that was conducted by GDF Sewers' Mine Technical Compliance Manager, Mr Kemsley, in 2012. Mr Kemsley, in his audit in 2012, concluded that recommendation 6, the one that's just been referred to from the 2008 report, had not been implemented. That is, that the risk assessment recommended had not been completed. The inquiry has before it a statement from Mr Prezioso, and it will be recalled that Mr Prezioso gave evidence towards the end of last week on this topic. And in his statement he identifies a number of steps that were taken subsequent to the 2008 fire to identify hotspots and some other relevant matters. However, he ultimately conceded that no risk assessment had been conducted as recommended, and he was unable to advise the inquiry if the issues identified in Mr Kemsley's 2012 audit had been revisited since that time. It's noted that Mr Kemsley remains employed by GDF Sewers. That's the evidence before the inquiry, and there's been no reason advanced for why he hasn't given evidence. Given the focus of the inquiry on the failure by GDF Sewers to implement this vital recommendation from its 2008 report, it is surprising that the inquiry has not heard from Mr Kemsley. Before leaving the topic of this 2008 report, it's necessary to refer briefly to the evidence before the inquiry about the regulator's awareness of the report, that is the VWA. It's to be recalled that the VWA assumed responsibility for regulating health and safety in mines on the 1st of January 2008, and this fire occurred on the 14th of September 2008. The evidence before the inquiry is that a VWA inspector attended at the mine on both the 16th and the 22nd of September in response to being notified of the fire. On the second of those visits, the inspector was informed that an environmental and engineering consultancy firm, GHD, had been contracted to investigate the fire incident. The evidence is that WorkCover never asked for a copy of the report, and as a result, obviously, they were in no position to monitor the implementation by GDF Sewers with the recommendations. It's most unfortunate that that opportunity was not taken up by the regulator. The approach of WorkCover in relation to that report stands in stark contrast with the evidence of what the mine regulator did in a similar situation some 2 years earlier in relation to a report into a 2006 fire. Ms White explained to the inquiry that an inspector of her department issued an improvement notice to GDF Sewers in February of 2007 requiring it to comply with the recommendations made by GHD in its 2006 report, and the inquiry was advised that this led to a review by GDF Sewers of its fire policy and code of practice, which was one of the recommendations made. I note the time. I'm about to go on to another topic.
All right, we'll resume. Sue.